I don't know about you, but really tired of these things. Tired of this pandemic. You know, this is July. And I don't know if you remember, but this was supposed to be all over in July. That's what we heard in March. Certainly by July, we'll be out of this by the middle of the summer. You know, we might have a new normal, but now it seems like more and more people are getting this coronavirus. And you know, what can we do besides wait on the Lord? There's really nothing else that we can do. You know, we believe that He is sovereign, and in His time, this is going to pass. But it's hard waiting. This morning I want to talk to you about, or answer the question, why is waiting on God so hard? In Isaiah chapter 40, verses 27 to 31, Isaiah records this prophecy. Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord. My cause is disregarded by my God. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and His understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. In this passage, Isaiah is prophesying about what it will be like for Israel in the future after they have been taken into exile by the Babylonians. And he speaks in this passage of the despair of the new generation who were born into captivity. Those who only heard the stories from their parents about the land of Israel. They had grown up in Babylon, hearing the stories of the hope of God's promise to set them free and take them back to the land of Israel. But it hadn't happened yet. And they were starting to think that maybe God's power and God's wisdom did not extend beyond the land of Israel to the land of Babylon. Or it did not extend beyond the stories of the past to their present circumstances. They were growing old in Babylon just like their parents did. What was the point of passing this same hope on to their children? They were downcast to the point of despair. They were ready to give up. But Isaiah encourages them to continue to wait on God, to put their hope in God, to continue to trust in Him, because His promise will not fail. But in the meantime, they could find renewed strength and power to rise above their circumstances. But they would continue to have to wait and hope in God. In Psalm 42, verse 11, the psalmist identifies with this. He says, why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God. He says, for I will yet praise Him, my Savior and my God. Waiting on God is so hard because, first of all, there's the problem of waiting. Verse 27 says, "Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord. My cause is disregarded by my God." The New English Translation puts it this way: "Why do you say, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel? The Lord is not aware of what is happening to me. My God is not concerned about my vindication." So many of us, in the midst of this pandemic, find ourselves in a similar situation. It's gotten to the point where we're starting to lose more than just our jobs. We're starting to lose hope. For a month, there were no new cases. And then this week, they've started to pile up again. When is this going to end? The fact is, we despise waiting. We don't like to wait. And we don't always comprehend that the passage of time does not mean that God is unaware of our circumstances. But it's hard. But just because we're ready to give up doesn't mean what God has promised won't happen. And we're in no way the first of God's people that He is required to wait. And should the Lord tarry, we will not be the last. Joshua and Caleb had to spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness, waiting to enter the promised land that they were ready to enter from the beginning, but because the rest of the people didn't share their faithfulness and their faith in God and their hope and their trust in God, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. This coming generation of Israel that Isaiah was prophesying about would have to wait 70 years from the time of their captivity until the time King Cyrus would allow them to return to the city of Jerusalem. Think about how much of your life you spend waiting. Think about it. For just the normal things of life. Waiting is really a normal part of life for us. You go to the grocery store, you have to wait in line. You go to a government office, you have to wait. You go to the bank, you have to wait. God forbid you go to the doctor's office, you just have to wait. You know, I wonder sometimes why some doctors even bother to give appointments. Because you're sitting there an hour and a half later, and you're still number 3 in line. We are constantly in a state of waiting for something, for some reason or the other. But of course, it's not like how long we have to wait on God. But Abraham waited 25 years from the day God promised to give him a son and make him a great nation until the day that Isaac was born. 25 years. Joseph waited 13 years from the time God revealed that he would be exalted above everyone in his family until the day that he became governor of Egypt. David had to wait 22 years from the time he was anointed king by the prophet Samuel until the day that he became king over all Israel. But yet he had at least 2 opportunities to kill King Saul and take the throne that was already rightfully his. But David's attitude was, touch not the Lord's anointed. Saul was anointed king as well. And David chose to wait for God to remove him rather than take it upon himself. It's no wonder David could write in Psalm 27, wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. In Psalm 37, verse 7, he writes, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Jesus, at the age of 12, was in the temple confounding the teachers. At the age of 12, he already knew more than those who were the rabbis, the teachers in the temple in Jerusalem. But it was not yet his time. He still had to wait 18 years until the age of 30 to begin his ministry. He was ready at age 12, but it was not God's time yet. We have a problem with waiting. We despise waiting, and we're tired of waiting. We have a difficulty even waiting for the things we know are going to happen, like the promises of God. We all get tired of waiting at some point, some of us much sooner than others. But just because we get tired of waiting doesn't mean our period of waiting will come to an end. I mentioned Abraham earlier, waiting for a son. He got tired. And so he accepted Sarah's maid as a wife, and Ishmael was born. But Ishmael was not the son of promise. He still had to wait another 14 years before Isaac was born. But he got tired waiting after 11. But he still had to wait a total of 25. Even after Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's chief baker and chief cupbearer, and the cupbearer, Joseph said, would be restored to his position. And he promised Joseph that once he was restored, he would remember Joseph, but he didn't. And Joseph still had to stay in that prison for another 2 years before God's timing was right. He had to wait. David, I mentioned he waited 22 years to become king of all Israel. After 15 years, he was made king over the tribe of Judah. But he still had to wait another 7 years to be made king over all 12 tribes of Israel. One of the lessons we must learn about God's timing, someone put it this way: delay does not mean denied. Just because we have to wait doesn't mean the answer is no. James 5 and verse 7 puts it like this: be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You know, I do a little farming. Not the best at it. Someone said to me, citrus trees are the easiest trees to grow. Well, it seemed like I could grow every other tree other than citrus. Every citrus tree I have planted is either dead or dying. But I know a little bit about waiting patiently for the rain to come. It seemed like the spring rains this year would never come. But the farmer has to wait. He has to wait for the spring rains, and he has to wait for the autumn rains. The spring rains for the time of planting, the autumn rains for the time just before harvesting, but he has to wait. And James is saying we have to get an understanding of that. We have to have that same kind of patience. We have to be able to wait for God's timing. But it's hard. It's hard because we have a problem with waiting, and because of the priority of God. The priority of God is often not our priority. And thank God, our priority is often not God's priority. God frequently calls on us to wait. This has been the way God has operated from the beginning. His timing is always perfect. And you know, even after we find that out, in one instance, when he calls upon us to wait again, we somehow seem to have the same problem. Even though we know when it happens, it will be in God's perfect timing, it will be right, and it will be the best for us, we still have a problem. Our agenda is often not God's agenda. Often God's agenda and our agenda just do not align. And even though God's timing is perfect, it's often not ever soon enough for us. But Isaiah says to Israel, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting or the eternal God. He is the creator of the ends of the earth." In other words, what he's saying, he is creator, meaning everything began with him. But he says he is the creator of the ends of the earth. He is also in control from the beginning all the way to the end. And so Isaiah is saying, because of that, we can trust him. We can trust him to do what's best. We can trust him to do it at the best possible time. But it's the waiting that's often the problem, because we don't understand the priority of God. It says he's the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. The problem is God understands exactly what is going on, but we don't have any idea what's going on. But God's priority is his plans and his purposes. And we are but a part of that. And sometimes we fail to see just how small we are in relation to the overall plan of God. And that's because our problems, our troubles, our circumstances are so huge to us. We look at a mountain and it's enormous. It's beyond our comprehension. And yet the Bible tells us that at our return, the mountains will flee. What is big to us is nothing to God. And so, if our circumstances to God is so small, even though it may seem big to us, why should our individual circumstances be a huge priority for God? Yes, he's going to work everything out for all of us in his time. But it's difficult for us to see that. We wait on a God who is eternal, who is outside of time. He is not bound by time in any way like us. Almost everything we contemplate doing, we wonder if we're going to have the time. God never worries about whether he's going to have time to do anything. In 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, he says, "But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day." So to God, if he has a long list of things to do, he can make one day last 1,000 years. And if he happens to be in a hurry, he can make 1,000 years last but one day. We wait on a God who sees everything with clarity, who knows all things. And waiting on a God like this is not easy. In Psalm 69, verses 1 to 3, David cries out, "Save me, O God, for the waters has come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths where there is no foothold." In other words, he says, my feet can no longer touch the bottom. The water is up to my neck. You ever been in that situation? I remember one of the first times I went on Cabbage Beach. Walked into the water was here. Took one more step and it was up here. All of a sudden, my feet were no longer on the bottom. From one step to the next. And this is what David is saying. He's saying, I have come into the deep waters, the floods engulf me. I am worn out, calling for help. David is saying, I'm up to my neck in this. I'm calling for help, and no one is coming to help me. He says, my throat is parched. My eyes fail, looking for my God. David is saying, I'm up to my neck, and I've been calling out to God until my voice is gone. And my eyes are beginning to fail. I can't tread water any longer, and God still hasn't answered me. He still hasn't helped me. In the midst of his circumstances, as bad as they were, God still called on David to wait. The time wasn't right yet. And often, we see our circumstances so much bigger, so much worse than they really are, because we think nobody else is worse off than us. And so we're not even bothering to look around. Someone said, I used to complain about not having shoes until I saw a man who had no feet. And so Isaiah says, why do you complain, Jacob? In verse 29 and 30, we see God's promise. It says, he gives strength to the weak and increases the power of the weak. Even the youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. Even the young and the strong get tired and weary of waiting. Even the young and the strong have their limits. God expects us to get tired while we wait. But he's promised to provide us with the strength and the power to endure the wait. But see, God doesn't expect us to just wait. And see, for many of us, sometimes all we want to do is sit down and wait. But God never calls on us to be idle. He never calls on us to do nothing, regardless of what our circumstances are. There's always something else we could be doing besides just sitting down and waiting. I had a cousin one time I knew her. Well, she was actually my mom's cousin. I guess that just made her my cousin too. And I knew her from I was 10 years old until she died when I was in my 30s. And for those more than 20 years, she talked about nothing but the fact that she was just waiting to die. She thought, this is the end. And the end took more than 20 years to come. And I think so much about the opportunities 20 years gave her before death came. And even though she was capable of doing other things, she just sat around and did nothing. Yeah, she did the everyday things. You know, she cleaned the house, she cooked food. But she was just hanging in there until death came. And death took more than 20 years. So much was missed out on. But God calls on us not just to wait, but He expects us to occupy while we wait. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 10 through 14, Jeremiah declares this over Jerusalem and Judah that were surrounded by the armies of Babylon. The Babylonians were building siege towers to the walls of Jerusalem. The people were trapped inside with very little to eat. And Jeremiah writes, this is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, see, He had already told them that God said, you're going to be taken into captivity into Babylon. The Babylonian armies are going to overrun this city and they're going to take you captive. But He says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. This is the context for the verse we love to quote, verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. But the problem was, for Israel, before that, those plans for hope and a future, there would be 70 years of captivity. See, we like to declare that God has plans to give us hope and a future, but in the context, God was saying to Israel, you're going to have to wait 70 years. See, we want the plans for hope and a future, but we don't want to wait. And that's the danger of pulling one verse out of a passage and quoting it and declaring it over our lives without understanding everything that God was saying. So God says, I have plans for you to give you hope and a future. He says, then you will call on me, verse 12, and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. This was God's promise to Israel, but they would have to wait 70 years before it would come to pass. What would they do for 70 years? Would they just be sitting around waiting in Babylon? You know, just walking around laughing at the Babylonians and saying, oh, you know, the time is coming when we're going to leave this place. No. God expected them to occupy while they waited, just like he expects us to occupy while we wait. There are things he expects us to do while we wait. This doesn't mean simply twiddling our thumbs and worrying about when this day was going to come. You have to go a little earlier into chapter 29 of Jeremiah, verses 4 through 7, to find out what God said to them prior to this. Isaiah writes, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." What was God saying to them? God was saying, as bad as your situation may be while you're in captivity in Babylon, pray for this city, because when this city prospers, you will prosper. When this city has peace, you will have peace. Don't just sit there doing nothing. Life goes on. Even in the midst of this pandemic, life goes on. We still need to be praying for the city. We still need to be trusting God. We still need to be doing what God has called us to do. This pandemic may have put a lot on hold, but it hasn't put the plans and purposes of God on hold. And we're a part of that, and we have to continue doing our part. He says, seek the peace and prosperity. Do what you can to make this place prosper, even though it's not your home, even though it's only a temporary place for you to be. Let me tell you, nothing is more temporary than circumstances. And so our circumstances are temporary. But God is saying, listen, continue to do what I've called you to do. While we wait on God, life still goes on. We must keep living and serving God. When we are faced with difficult situations, our greatest desire is to get out of them. But God provides us not with a way to get away from them, but with a way to rise above them. In Psalm 55, verses 1 to 8, it's a long passage, but I want to read it. It says, listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me and I am distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked, for they bring down suffering on me and assail me in their anger. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. David was in dire straits. I don't know about you, but I've never been in a situation like that. Not that bad. Close, but not that bad. And so in verse 6, David says, I said, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all this anguish, this fear, this horror, he said, I said, oh, that I had the wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and storm. I remember so many times as a little boy thinking those same thoughts. It was a song that was popular in the late 60s and 70s. If I had the wings of a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. And so often in the midst of our circumstances, that's our greatest desire. We may wish and even long for wings of a dove just so we could get away. We're so tired of waiting. We're so tired of these circumstances. We just want to get out and get away. But God doesn't give us wings of a dove to get away from our circumstances. He gives us wings of an eagle so we can soar above the storm of our circumstances. He says in chapter 40 of Isaiah, verse 31, but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. If I could go back to Joseph for a moment. Joseph, when he was sold by his brothers into slavery, and he arrived as a slave in Potiphar's house, he didn't put his head down and says, I'm nothing but a slave. Let me just do whatever my master asked me to do. The best thing for a servant, for a slave, is not to be noticed. No. Joseph put on those eagle wings and he rose up to run Potiphar's house. He was a slave, yes. But he put his hand to his task and God prospered him. And he said, listen, God said that one day my family is going to bow before me. And he never let go of that dream, never let go of that promise. Even as a slave, he rose up above his circumstances. And Potiphar saw that God's hand was on him. And it said Potiphar took no thought of anything in his house except what he was going to eat, what was put before him. Joseph ran everything else. And even after Potiphar's wife wanted to commit adultery with him, and Joseph ran away, and she told her husband that Joseph tried to rape her, and Joseph was thrown into prison. What's worse than being a slave? Being a slave in prison. But Joseph didn't just sit there in that prison and say, I'm just going to keep my head down and do my time. No. Joseph, again, remembering God's promise, put on those eagle wings and rose up to run that prison. You often had the term saying, inmates can't run the prison. Well, Joseph was an inmate. But yet, the head of the prison saw that God's hand was on him, and Joseph rose up to run that prison while he waited for God's promise to be fulfilled. I'm not going to tell you this morning that if Joseph didn't rise above his circumstances in Potiphar's house and in that prison, that God would not have elevated him to governor of Egypt. God may have found another way to do it. But God's way to do it was to make sure that Potiphar recognized God's hand in his life, that the head of that prison recognized God's hand in his life, that the chief cupbearer recognized God's hand in his life, so in God's time, Pharaoh would have a dream himself. And only Joseph would be able to interpret that dream. And so when Pharaoh had that dream, Joseph was ready. Because he refused to just wait. He decided to do while he waited. Joseph kept on rising above his circumstances. He learned to run a house, then a prison, and so when God was ready, he was ready. When God's plan and God's purpose and timing aligned, he was presented with an opportunity to run an entire nation, and Joseph was ready. So important for us to wait on God. Yes, we get tired, but God has promised to give us strength. to give us power to rise above our circumstances. Maybe God gave you a vision that one day you would own your own house, but right now you're working in somebody else's house. Well, I say rise up and run that house while you wait. Maybe God has given you a vision that you would one day own your own company, but right now you're working in somebody else's company. I say rise up on those eagle wings and run that company until God gives you your own. Why would you just go to work every day and keep your head down with no ambition, with no desire to move ahead, just waiting for God to give you what he promised? No. In the meantime, get ready to run your own company by learning to run the one you're working in now. That's what Joseph did. No matter what his circumstances were, Joseph kept rising to the top, just like it says cream rises to the top. Well, guess what? We're no different from Joseph. We serve the same God. We are that same cream that keeps rising to the top. And even in the midst of this pandemic, we as God's people, individually, collectively, we have an opportunity. There's always an opportunity in our circumstances. It might not be the one we're looking for. It might not be the one we're waiting for, but it's an opportunity nonetheless. And God expects us to make the most of it until he does what he promised. No matter what our circumstances are now, we can rise above them. It may take time, but it will happen. When we get tired and weary, we lean on God's strength and power. We mount up on those eagle wings and we soar above the storms of life. We refuse to be downcast. We put our hope in God and we wait on him. Israel was exiled in Babylon for 70 years. They were tired of waiting to go home. They were beginning to wonder if God was even any more aware of their circumstances. They were wondering if God had forgotten his promise. God's answer to them was the same as his answer to us. If you're tired and weary, here is the strength and power you need. Keep on waiting. Keep on trusting. Here's a pair of eagle wings. Soar above your circumstances. Let your spirit rise above the storm. Breakthrough is coming. Keep on hoping, keep on trusting, keep on believing, keep on serving God. For God's sake, do not give up. Do not give up. In all our circumstances, no matter how negative, God has provided an opportunity for us to rise. Every time the enemy attacks, God still proves himself faithful. God still proves himself faithful. See, if his faithfulness is only expressed in our endurance or in our patience, it is nonetheless expressed. The fact that the enemy can't break us is evidence of the faithfulness of God. Because we can't stand against him in our own strength. It's only when we lean on God's strength and God's power that we can stand. And that's a testament to God's faithfulness. In spite of what some people are saying out there, I do not believe that COVID-19 is the end of us. I don't know about you. This too will pass. The question is, while we wait, will we make the most of the opportunities we have? Will we rise above our circumstances and continue to serve God, continue to trust him? I hope we don't have to wait 7 years. I got a feeling I won't be here 70 years from now. but God is faithful. Let's stand. Stand with me.